Shout out to Forrest Haggerty and his channel. Forrest Haggerty has an excellent channel where he goes over cases and murders and crimes, but he does it via Google Earth. And he really lays it out for you of how things look now versus then, and how the streets are then versus now. I always look at the telephone poles if they're within the vicinity, because I can tell what year they were put in. So just to check here, these particular poles were put in 1993, so these were not the original poles that were there that night. So slowly and carefully, Officer Campbell made the turn, faced the car north, and parked. Powell has Ian turn the headlights off and orders Jimmy Smith to get out of the vehicle. Now, I want to emphasize this part in the book. The Onion Field by Joseph Wamba is an incredible book. The movie's very well done too. He wrote the screenplay for it. But I want to emphasize this quote in the book because it's an important part of the confusion that happened that night and in the looming days that followed. And the quote is, "Then a hand picked up Ian Campbell's Smith & Wesson, which was in the seat between them." And that's important, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this episode. So Powell then tells Ian to get out of the vehicle. Powell was standing between the passenger side door. Jimmy was at the rear of the vehicle. Ian steps out on the driver's side with his hands up and facing Jimmy at this point. And Ian, of course, is on the driver's side of the vehicle. So this leaves Officer Hettinger inside of the car, still cramped in the back seat. Greg Powell orders Hettinger to get out of the car. And Officer Hettinger says, "Can I use my hands, or how do you want me to do this? Just crawl over?" He said, "Yeah, crawl over." So Officer Hettinger uses his elbows to essentially crawl out of the vehicle. And this put Officer Hettinger standing there next to Officer Campbell on the driver's side of the vehicle. Karl is standing to the left of Ian. Now at the rear of the vehicle, both officers can see the silhouettes of Jimmy Lee Smith and Gregory Powell, and they can see that Powell is holding a weapon. And Powell walks over to Jimmy Smith and whispers something to him. And I don't think it was ever deciphered or figured out what it was that Powell whispered to Smith. Powell then walks over to the two officers, particularly in front of Officer Hettinger, but is looking right at Officer Campbell and asks him, "Have you ever heard of the Little Lindbergh Law?" In which Officer Campbell answers yes. Then Gregory Powell raises the gun and shoots Officer Campbell in the mouth, right above the top lip. Officer Campbell falls to the ground on his back. So at this point, Officer Hettinger is screaming in terror, and he begins to run off. And during this time that he ran off, 4 more shots are put into Officer Campbell, who was already on the ground. This is where there's some confusion, because neither Greg Powell or Jimmy Lee Smith admitted to shooting the 4 shots into Officer Campbell. Both of them blamed each other. Now, in the movie, directed by Harold Becker, the way they shot that conveyed the confusion as to what happened. It was a good way that they shot that. You can see Officer Hettinger, played by John Savage, running towards camera, and James Woods, who plays Gregory Powell, is standing next to Franklin Seals, who plays Jimmy Lee Smith, and they're standing over Ian Campbell, who's played by Ted Danson. Now, in Jimmy Lee Smith's right hand is a gun, and in Gregory Powell's left hand is a gun, and both of their arms are kind of really close, overlapping each other, both pointing down to Ian Campbell, and then shots are fired. So you really can't tell who was pulling the trigger in that shot. So I thought that was done well to convey that confusion. Now, Officer Hettinger was zigzagging and running away as Gregory Powell was firing shots at him, trying to find him. Hettinger runs to the left to a barbed wire fence and leaps over it. There's barbed wire and tumbleweed. He cuts himself, rips his pants, and ends up able to hide momentarily amongst the tumbleweed and the darkness. And at this point, he's thinking, instead of running north to the highway, which is what Powell and Smith figured he would do. He ended up coming back around south, back towards Officer Campbell's body. Gregory Powell, after throwing a few more shots, runs back to the car, yells at Jimmy Smith, asking him what the hell's the matter with you. This guy's getting away. He grabs Hettinger's flashlight and heads back to the field there just to shine some light to see if maybe he can find Hettinger. Officer Hettinger is still lying there, hiding out. Does look at his watch, and it's 12:15 a.m. at this point. Then Greg Powell heads back to the car, gets inside, and starts to reload whatever guns were fired. He leaves the .38 with Smith, and then Powell takes the automatic and Karl's flashlight with him back on foot, back up the road looking for Hettinger. So Jimmy Smith suggests that he takes the car, goes and looks for Hettinger, while Greg Powell is on foot, and then he'll come back around for him to pick him up. Greg Powell agrees, and Jimmy Smith takes off. Meanwhile, Officer Hettinger is headed south, then west, then north. He's kind of zigzagging in the field, just trying to lose these guys. He's tired. It's dark. He doesn't know the terrain. His partner's been killed. It's very, very chaotic. So as Officer Hettinger is racing across these fields as fast as he can, he comes across a farmhand on a tractor, what they call a cat, a man by the name of Emmanuel McFadden. Mr. McFadden helps Officer Hettinger. He allows him to get on the cat, and they take it for a little bit anyway, but once they find out it's too slow to gain any ground, they jump off of it, because in the distance they can see the flashlights moving, headlights moving, headed their way. So they continue on foot, and at one point Mr. McFadden looks back to where the cat is still running, and he sees a flashlight moving next to where the tractor's parked. Emmanuel McFadden was extremely scared. He didn't know what the heck was going on. This guy just comes running up to him saying he's been shot at and his partner's been killed. So there was a point where Mr. McFadden separates himself from Officer Hettinger and just pretty much wants to lose him because he doesn't want any of these problems. But he changed his mind and waited for him. So now the two of them were heading towards a house at Mettler Ranch. But as they got a little closer, Emmanuel McFadden thought twice about it and said, well, whoever's chasing us can get to this house quicker than us. So maybe they're there waiting for us. So they changed direction. They continued west, keeping an eye on the lights in the distance, and they made it to a house at Opal Fry Ranch. Knocked on the door. A gentleman by the name of Jack Fry answers the door, and at the house was Mr. Fry's wife and their teenage son. Hettinger gets to go in, and that's where the call's made for help. And then a slight knock on the door is heard. A few minutes later, the door is opened, and Mr. Fry has a shotgun aimed at Emmanuel McFadden. And then once they figured out who he was, Mr. McFadden was allowed to come in, and they called for help. Back to Greg Powell, who was still alone on foot. He goes back to the coupe, back to Officer Campbell's body, and then rolls Officer Campbell into a ditch. And Officer Campbell landed face down, left arm up, and it seemed as if he was looking at his watch. In the movie, Powell goes back to Ian's body earlier than he did in the movie and rolls the body into the ditch. And also in the movie, the ditch wasn't in front of the car, where in the book, the ditch headed east and west, and that's what stopped the car. Jimmy Smith decided to just leave Gregory Powell in the field, desert him. He didn't want any other parts of this. And Greg Powell figured this out pretty quick. So it was about 12:40 a.m. at this point where Gregory Powell realized that Jimmy Smith wasn't coming back for him. So Powell goes and steals a car from the Riddick family. Now, the Riddick family lived in a neighborhood in the Clifford Mettler Ranch area. He stole the car and headed back to the Hideaway, which was the hotel they were staying at already. Now, Jimmy Smith had a decision to make. He had the vehicle, but does he head back to L.A., where they're probably really looking for him at this point, or does he continue up towards the Frisco area? The gas gauge was extremely low in the car Smith was in, so he pulls off in this town called Lamont in a parking area, leaves the car there and continues on foot. throughout the night and ends up in a rooming house called Mom's Rooming House to spend the night. He checks in, no problem. So Greg Powell, now that he has a stolen vehicle, heads to the hideout, which was the Highway Motel where they were already staying, and he wants to switch cars because they have the station wagon parked there. So he gets inside his room, begins to shave his head, begins to switch cars, and then realizes that the keys to the station wagon are in his girlfriend Maxine's purse, who's in LA. So now he's frantic. So he finds a coin, I believe it was a dime, to switch plates from the station wagon that they drove up to Bakersfield with the stolen vehicle, and drive out of there with the stolen vehicle and different plates. And at this time, the stolen vehicle from the Riddick household was called in, and police knew, based on the call from Officer Hettinger, what was going on, more or less. So they were on the lookout for two men in a stolen red and white Plymouth. Greg Powell was eventually pulled over by Officers Christ and Odom, and they quickly found out that that wasn't his vehicle, that the plates didn't match, the registration didn't match, and they arrested him. Now, Jimmy Smith, who made his way to Mom's rooming house, checked in okay and used the community bathroom, but it wasn't within 5 to 10 minutes that he was there that police came breaking down the door and detained him. So I wanted to get into what happened just before that night, March 9th. So in regards to the 1946 maroon Ford coupe, there's somewhat of a story on how they got to get that car. Initially, it was Gregory Powell, his girlfriend Maxine, and Jimmy Smith. They drove up to Boulder City in a station wagon. Gregory Powell knew a guy out there in Boulder City that was selling a car, that particular car. And they drove up there, they bought it from him, and they left at 2 in the morning to head to San Francisco. And they stopped in Bakersfield at the Highway Motel and spent the night there. And in the middle of the night, Jimmy Smith hopped into the car, was going to take off in it, in the coupe. And Gregory Powell caught him outside, and Jimmy Smith talked his way out of it. So the initial plan was to go to Frisco and see what they can do up there, you know, what robberies they can hit, whatever they can do up there. But Greg Powell changed the plan and said, hey, Jimmy, we're going to head back down to L.A. And, you know, Jimmy Smith didn't like that plan. He didn't like the way Greg Powell was changing things. He just didn't like his whole M.O. So at first, it was Greg Powell and Maxine in the station wagon, and Jimmy Smith was driving the coupe, headed back to L.A. They switched up. They even passed the area off of Maricopa Highway that they were going to soon return to later that night.